My son abandoned his mother's funeral, shrugging it off as if saying goodbye to the woman who had raised him wasn't worth the effort. While I stood over freshly dug earth, numb and hollow, watching the casket of my wife lowered into the ground, he was sprawled out under the Florida sun, basking on golden sands, as if nothing in this world had changed. The cruelty of it didn't strike me all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a wound that refuses to clot. A week later, his voice found me again, not to offer comfort or regret, but to plead for money. "Dad," he said, almost frantic, "the mortgage hasn't been paid." My answer was sharp, my chest tightening as if my own heart had turned against me. "I don't care anymore," I told him flatly, each word heavy as stone. He went quiet, stunned, but that was only the beginning of the reckoning. That day, at the cemetery, I couldn't stop my hand from trembling as I pressed Timothy's name on my phone. Once, twice. By the fourth call, my thumb ached from the pressure, but the silence on the other end hurt more. Around me, life played out in muted tones of grief. The funeral director cast me a look that carefully trained sympathy professionals wear, and it made my stomach twist with shame and anger all at once. I turned my eyes away, forcing my attention onto Margaret's casket. Polished oak, smooth, beneath my hand. White lilies draped over brass handles that caught faint flashes of light when the clouds shifted overhead. Every detail of that box was perfect, dignified, final, everything my son's absence was not. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each chime cutting into the silence like a cruel reminder. Relatives trickled in. Black cars lined neatly along the curb, whispers rising and falling with the sound of shuffling feet. I noticed Aunt May clutching her tissue so tightly it seemed ready to tear, her eyes already swollen red. Cousin Robert adjusted his tie again and again, nervously checking his watch as though the ceremony had to run like clockwork. Everyone had a place, a role, a duty. Everyone except my son. By the 6th ring, I had nearly given up. Then I heard his voice. "Dad," a relief for half a second, until the background gave him away. Noise, not of silence or solemnity, but of life being wasted. Laughter. Music. The roar of a crowd that didn't belong anywhere near a family tragedy. "Timothy, son, where are you? The ceremony begins in 30 minutes. My voice broke in my own ears. For a moment, the only reply was more of that careless noise, and then waves. My chest tightened. "Waves, Dad, I can't make it," he said finally, irritation seeping through. "I have important business to handle." Important business. The words froze me in place, an icy grip squeezing the back of my neck. I pressed my hand harder against Margaret's casket, feeling its cold, polished surface, grounding myself in wood and grief. She would have known what to say to him. She always did. She could soften his heart in ways I never managed. But she wasn't here. It was only me. And my son on the other end of the line, turning his back on everything she had been. "What business," I whispered, more to myself than to him, "could be more important than your mother's funeral?" There was a pause then, long enough for hope to flicker before it was crushed. When he spoke again, his tone was not the son I raised, but a stranger's, dismissive, cold, almost bored. "Honestly, this whole thing isn't worth my time. Stop bothering me." And just like that, he was gone. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand, as if its weight carried every missed call, every unanswered plea, every unspoken truth between us. Around me, the world refused to pause. Guests shuffled quietly to their seats. The pastor arranged his notes with practiced care. Maintenance workers cleared pathways in the distance. But I stood utterly still, caught in the impossible space between the woman I had loved for 37 years and the son who had just abandoned us both. "Timothy," I whispered into the dead line, my voice fraying, "your mother, she's—" The dial tone cut me off, sharp and merciless, like a blade across my throat. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at its black screen, until my reflection warped back at me, pale and distorted. "Not worth his time." The words replayed in my head, jagged and raw, while memories came rushing in uninvited. Margaret, driving 6 hours through a snowstorm to sit at Timothy's bedside when he caught pneumonia in college. Margaret, rearranging her life to attend every marketing presentation he gave, even when it meant missing her own sister's birthday. Margaret, defending him to her friends with that gentle fierceness of hers when he skipped 3 Christmases in a row because he was too busy. And now, in the moment she most deserved his devotion, he dismissed her existence like an inconvenience. The first drops of rain brushed my cheek, cool at first, then warmer as they mingled with my tears. "Cole," the funeral director said softly, approaching with the careful distance of a man used to grief, "we should begin seating the family shortly." His voice was professional, respectful, but it pressed me forward when my heart wanted to collapse. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket as though hiding a crime and turned toward the relatives filing in. Somehow, by instinct more than will, I shook hands, offered automatic words of thanks. "Thank you for coming." She would have appreciated this. "Yes," she fought bravely. Each phrase left my lips without meaning, my mind still locked on Timothy's voice and the casual cruelty he had laced into those words. Aunt May clutched my arm, her hand trembling. "Where's Timothy?" "I haven't seen him yet." "He'll be along," I said, and the lie tasted bitter like swallowing ash. Important business. Even repeating it silently felt like betrayal. Margaret deserved the truth. If anyone had earned it, it was her. But in that moment, with our family gathered, and her casket gleaming under the storm-gray sky, I couldn't bring myself to shatter the illusion. I couldn't admit out loud that our only child had chosen beaches and laughter over this final goodbye. Thunder rolled across the sky as I guided May toward the front row. The ceremony would begin with or without Timothy, because Margaret's life deserved to be honored, her years of love and sacrifice marked with dignity. As I sank into my seat, adjusting my black tie one final time, I told myself to focus on her, to let the words spoken today be for her. But I couldn't shake the echo, that cold dismissal replaying in my ears. "This whole thing isn't worth my time." The pastor stepped to the podium, Bible open to a ribbon-marked page. Behind him, Margaret's photograph smiled from its easel, framed by her favorite white lilies. Her eyes in that picture were exactly as I remembered them, warm on our wedding day, hopeful when Timothy first learned to walk, steady and reassuring through every trial our family endured. The rain picked up now, soft at first, then steady, pattering against the canopy overhead, like the sky itself was grieving. Guests around me shifted, dabbed their eyes, bowed their heads. I shook hands again, murmured gratitude I didn't feel, then finally folded into the front row seat. The pastor's voice rose, warm and reverent, weaving images of Margaret's life that should have filled my chest with pride. "She was a devoted mother who always put family first," he said. "She believed in the power of love to heal any wound." My phone buzzed against my chest, once, then again. I tried to ignore it, forcing my gaze back to the pastor's lips, but my mind slipped away, back to Timothy, back to his voice. Another buzz, insistent this time, pulled me under. Around me, 40 guests sat in quiet respect, Cousin Robert dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, May holding her crumpled tissue. They were present, they were here, they honored her memory, and her own son was not. The phone trembled in my hand as I slipped it from my pocket, shielding the glow from curious eyes. 3 new notifications lit the screen. Instagram, Sarah, my daughter-in-law. I barely understood the platform, but Margaret had once urged me to follow Sarah's account, claiming it was the only way we'd see glimpses of their lives. My thumb hovered over the alerts, the pastor's words echoing dimly in the background. She gave freely of her time, teaching children, not just academics, but kindness and integrity. And all I could think was, kindness, integrity, devotion, everything Margaret embodied, everything Timothy was throwing away. The irony cut through me like glass. I tapped the first notification, and in an instant the muted gray tones of the ceremony were replaced by colors too bright, too alive. My phone screen burst open with crystalline water glinting under the sun, white sand glowing as though painted, palm trees swaying lazily in a soft breeze. The sound of distant reggae floated over laughter so carefree it felt obscene against the backdrop of Margaret's funeral. Then Sarah's voice, cheery and unburdened. "What a perfect day in Miami. The weather is incredible." Miami. The camera panned, wide and indulgent, capturing a resort pool bordered by plush cabanas, half-drunk cocktails sweating in the heat, bronze strangers sprawled in swimsuits, a volleyball game in the distance. A paradise stamped with a time and place that confirmed what I already suspected. Posted 15 minutes ago. Miami Beach, Florida. My fingers clenched around the phone until my knuckles whitened. Important business, Timothy had said. That was his excuse. And here it was. His business laid bare for the world to admire in filtered hues and hashtags. While I clung to the last shreds of composure, while Margaret's casket stood draped in lilies and rain fell like tears from the heavens, he was reclining in a chair, sipping liquor through a straw, grinning at the sun. The pastor's voice rose above the hum of rain. Margaret's greatest joy came from watching her family grow and thrive. His words echoed in the hush, reverent, meant to soothe. But they only deepened the wound. On my screen, Sarah's manicured hand slipped into frame, clutching a tropical drink decked with pineapple and umbrellas. Behind her, laughter exploded from strangers splashing in the surf, their joy untouchable, unreachable. I wanted to hurl the phone across the wet grass, to shatter its smug glass face on the earth. I wanted to stand, to interrupt this solemn moment with the truth. No one here could imagine that Margaret's son, the boy she had nursed, defended, and adored beyond reason, was not only absent but reveling in his absence. My throat burned with words I couldn't speak. Instead, I slid the device back into my pocket, folding my grief over it like a shroud, and forced my face into the proper mask of mourning. Let the pastor finish. Let Margaret's friends, colleagues, and family remember her as she deserved, not as she had been forsaken. There would be time later, time to reckon with Timothy, time to decide what his betrayal demanded. But the rage would not rest. It clawed through me, making my hands shake, my leg bounce against the cold metal chair as though my body might revolt against stillness. Every word spoken of Margaret's devotion cut deeper. She gave freely of her love. She believed wounds could heal. She believed in family. Family. What a cruel word. For some wounds cannot be healed, not when inflicted by your own blood. The pastor closed his Bible with a gentle thud and stepped aside. Margaret's former principal approached the podium, shuffling papers nervously, her glasses sliding down her nose. She began to speak of Margaret as a colleague, a mentor, a friend who had shaped generations of children. But her words came to me muffled, as though through water. My focus slipped again to the funeral director at the back, his eyes catching mine. He nodded with that same trained sympathy as before, convinced my anguish was the ordinary grief of a husband burying his wife. If only he knew. The rain beat harder now against the canopy, steady and relentless, soaking the edges of my trousers. And in Florida the sun was shining. The weather was incredible. Perfect. Perfect for vacation. Perfect for laughter. Perfect for forgetting that your mother's body was about to be lowered into the cold ground. I whispered something, an excuse, an apology, I can't recall what, into the ear of the relative beside me, who pressed my hand softly and understanding. Then I rose, steady on the outside, volcanic within, and walked away from the crowd. Each step toward the cemetery shed, toward the shadowed maintenance area, seemed to fan the flames inside me. Rage built in waves, fed by Sarah's cheerful voice, echoing from memory, and the image of Timothy's drink, clinking against the rim of a poolside glass. 37 years Margaret had given him. 37 years of love, of sacrifice, of belief in the boy she thought he was. And this was her reward. 37 years. 37 years. Of Margaret pressing cool cloths against midnight fevers, of cheering from the audience at school plays, of clapping until her hands were red at graduations, of running mock interviews with him late into the night, so he would walk into real ones prepared. She gave him relationship advice he never heeded, defended him to friends who whispered behind our backs about his absence, made excuses for every missed holiday. She shipped care packages to that overpriced Manhattan apartment of his, filling them with homemade cookies, socks, and little notes in her neat handwriting, just so he would never forget that home was still here. And now, this was how he honored her memory. Behind the maintenance shed, away from the soft murmur of the ceremony and the rustle of umbrellas, I pulled out my phone. My hands were still shaking, but not from nerves this time. It was rage. Pure, uncut rage, the kind I hadn't felt in decades, Not since Timothy was 17 and totaled the family car on a joyride with reckless friends. Even then, Margaret had been there to temper me, to guide my words before anger could scorch the boy too badly. But now there was no Margaret, no gentle hand on my shoulder. There was only me, my fury, and the sharp edge of betrayal. I jabbed his contact with more force than necessary. One ring, two. My chest tightened, convinced he would let it go unanswered while sipping poolside drinks. But then, what now, Dad? The same irritated lilt, sharp as glass. This time I was ready. Timothy, I said, my voice low tight, trembling not from weakness but from contained fire. I just saw your wife's video, from Miami Beach. Silence. Nothing but the rush of wind through my speaker, and faint in the background, that same vacation noise, the laughter, the music, the sound of water. Finally, his voice feigning innocence. That's not what you think it is, Dad. Sarah's just, don't lie to me. My voice thundered against the shed's concrete walls, startling even me. I hadn't raised my voice in years, but it tore out of me now, jagged and raw. You're on a beach while we are burying your mother. Another pause, this one longer, and then the mask dropped. His voice was flat, unapologetic. Fine. Yes, I'm in Florida. So what? This funeral is a waste of my time. Those words struck harder than his first dismissal, because now I held proof in my hand. Proof that while Margaret's family sat huddled on folding chairs, listening to tributes, and watching flowers sag beneath the rain, her son was basking under palm trees. While her body waited in its polished oak, he was living his best life in swim trunks. I began pacing behind the shed, gravel crunching under my shoes. She gave birth to you. She loved you when no one else would. She defended you to everyone who ever criticized you. His reply cut through me like a blade of ice. She's dead, Dad. Standing around crying won't change that. I've got a life to live. I froze mid-step. A life to live. As if Margaret's death were nothing more than a scheduling conflict, an inconvenient interruption to his tan lines and cocktails. The rain pelted harder, dripping down my face, merging with tears I hadn't even realized had broken free. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear Margaret's former principal speaking into the microphone, recounting stories of her patience, her devotion to students, stories Timothy would never hear, because he had chosen beaches over mothers. You're not my son anymore. The words escaped before I could stop them, heavy and final, like the gavel of a judge. Good. He spat back, without hesitation, without even a quiver of regret. Don't call me again. The line went dead. I stared at the glowing screen. Call ended. My thumb moved before my brain caught up, pressing redial like a reflex. Once, voicemail. Again. This time, the number you are calling is not available. A third attempt. This caller has blocked you. Blocked. While Margaret lay in her casket 50 yards away, while guests bowed their heads in prayer, while rain soaked through the black fabric of my funeral suit, my son had not only abandoned me, he had cut me off, sealed the door shut, to ensure his vacation remained undisturbed. I tried again, twice. Each time the same cold automated rejection, the same wall rising higher between us, the same brutal reminder that Timothy had made his choice. Overhead, thunder cracked so loudly the ground seemed to shiver. Rain hammered against the shed's tin roof and streamed down my collar. And in that storm, as lightning split the sky, I felt something harden inside me. Whatever hope I had clung to for Timothy was gone. Margaret's love might have been unconditional. Mine no longer was. Behind me, the sound of the ceremony pressed on, muffled by the rain yet steady like a heartbeat, reminding me that life and loss would continue whether I stood in the storm or not. I thought I heard Thurman's voice. Old Thurman, who had once courted Margaret's best friend while I nervously asked Margaret out on those double dates 40 years ago. Back then she wore her favorite yellow sundress, hair catching the sunlight as though it belonged to her alone, and Timothy was just a wish we whispered about in the quiet moments. Those were the days when the future was a canvas blank and waiting, when the idea of raising a child together seemed like the kind of dream that would always end in joy, never in ruin. The weight of my phone pulled at my hand, its black screen reflecting a warped image of me, rain streaking across my cheeks, jaw set tight with fury, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. That tiny rectangle of glass had become both lifeline and weapon, a bridge to my son and the wall he had thrown up against me in the same breath. Blocked, cut off, discarded as thoughtlessly as Margaret's memory had just been discarded in Florida sand. The shed gave me no protection, yet I stayed. Rain poured through the gaps in the corrugated roof and soaked my jacket until it clung like armor I no longer wanted to wear. The storm seemed fitting. Here, grief and weather conspired to wash me raw, while somewhere under a relentless Florida sun my son lounged with drinks in hand, Sarah recording their laughter for an audience of strangers. The contrast split me open, our imperfect grief against their curated perfection. I forced myself to walk back toward the gathering, each step a sodden squelch in the grass turned to mud beneath the mourners' feet. Through the blur of falling rain, I saw them still seated under the canopy, bodies leaning close, tissues pressed to faces, determined to endure this final ritual of love despite the discomfort. That was real devotion, an act of loyalty Margaret deserved. And then my gaze snagged on the empty chair in the front row. It mocked me. It mocked her. Margaret had insisted on keeping that seat open, always clinging to the hope her boy would appear at the last moment, that he'd surprise us with repentance and love. Hope, she'd whispered more than once, is sometimes all a mother has. But I understood now. Hope was a cruel mistress. It had kept me dialing his number that morning despite every sign of his indifference. It had made me keep his contact in my phone labeled Timothy, son, as though words could tether a bond already severed. At the edge of the canopy, my sister caught my eye, her hand rising in a small gesture, inviting me to take the place beside her. I obeyed, dragging my body through the rain's resistance until I slipped back into the circle of mourners. The ceremony was nearly over. I could tell by the shifting, the quiet sniffles, the preparation for the last farewell. I sat, letting my sister's hand squeeze mine in silent solidarity, her gaze fixed forward on the podium where the pastor had returned. His voice was warm, full of truth as he spoke of Margaret. She devoted her life to nurturing young minds. She believed every child deserved patience, understanding, and unconditional support. The words cut me as deeply as they honored her, because I knew how true they were. Every ounce of her patience, her understanding, her unconditional love had gone into Timothy, and still he had walked away. My sister leaned close, whispering with the kind of tender ignorance only someone unexposed to the truth could carry. Margaret was so proud of Timothy. Remember how she'd show everyone those marketing awards, those certificates from New York. He must be devastated to miss this. Traffic from the city can be terrible. My throat burned as I swallowed against the truth. My eyes stayed fixed on the casket, on the lilies trembling in the wind like small white flames. I forced the lie out, tasting its bitterness with every syllable. He had obligations he couldn't avoid. It was the only shield I could offer Margaret's memory, the only way to keep my sister from knowing the filth of Timothy's neglect. What else could I say? That her beloved nephew had traded his mother's farewell for a poolside cocktail. That the boy Margaret had nursed and defended for 37 years had dismissed her life as a waste of time. No, I couldn't speak those words aloud. Not here, not now. And then, as though fate twisted the knife, my sister pressed on, smiling through her tears. Remember when Timothy was 8? Margaret spent 3 whole weeks helping him with that science project. The volcano that erupted right in the kitchen. The memory struck like lightning. I could see it, clear as if it were happening again. Timothy's face alight with excitement, baking soda and flour coating the counters, Margaret laughing as she cleaned up the mess, pride glowing in her eyes. The image clawed at my chest, tearing me open with grief I couldn't contain. "Daddy, when will Mama get better?" I made her a drawing. Timothy's little voice still echoed in my mind, a sound pulled from decades ago, back when he was just 8 years old, and Margaret had caught a simple case of bronchitis. Such a small thing, so harmless compared to what awaited her years later. Yet to him, it had been the end of the world. I can still see him standing there, clutching that drawing with crayon-smudged fingers, his eyes wide with a pure, uncomplicated concern. He loved her then, or at least he thought he did, in the way children do, freely, without condition. Margaret had never once missed a school presentation, no matter how sick she was herself. I remember her dragging her fever-ridden body into that cramped auditorium, bundled in sweaters, coughing quietly into a handkerchief, but clapping louder than anyone else when Timothy stood on stage. She would have walked through fire for him, and truth be told, she often did. There was the night she drove through a snowstorm, white-knuckled on the wheel, just to reach his college dorm when he was feverish with pneumonia. There was the birthday party for her own sister she skipped, because Timothy had a marketing presentation that meant the world to him. I'd watched her defend him countless times when friends asked why he never came home for holidays, why he rarely called, why he always seemed too busy. He has a demanding job, she'd say softly, but he loves us. And then 2 years ago, when the doctor first spoke the word cancer, Margaret's very first words had been about him. "How do we tell Timothy?" she whispered in that sterile office, her thin hand gripping mine like I was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. It was as if the diagnosis wasn't an assault on her body, but an imagined betrayal she feared would disappoint her son. I remember calling him that night, steadying my voice while my hands trembled against the receiver. "Son, your mother's having some health issues. Could you visit this weekend?" His answer came quick, too quick. "Dad, it's really busy at work. You know how it is. Tell Mom I'm thinking of her." "She'd rather hear it from you," I urged. "I'll try to call later." He never did. That became the rhythm of our days, her slipping further into illness, him pulling further away into excuses. The calls were brief, distracted, his tone restless as though each word was costing him money. Visits dwindled from monthly, to rare, to non-existent, each absence justified with deadlines, meetings, deals that couldn't wait. Margaret, frail but unyielding, always defended him. "He's just scared, Otis. Death frightens young people." Even as she grew thinner, even when her hands trembled too much to hold a cup, even when I had to help her rise from bed and walk to the bathroom, she clung to her defense of him. Last Thanksgiving, her voice had been a faint whisper as she asked, maybe Timothy could come for the holiday. I had promised I'd ask, but deep down I already knew the answer. She gave me a sad smile, and murmured more to herself than to me. "He's building his life. That's what children do. They build their own lives." But as I looked around at the 40 people who had braved the storm to sit in folding chairs for her farewell, I realized the truth Margaret had refused to see. Timothy hadn't been building a life. He had been tearing himself away from the one that included us. In her final weeks, she made me promise. "Promise me you'll understand him, Otis. He loves us in his own way." Her own way. The words haunt me, because what is love, if it hides behind excuses and broken promises? What is love if it can't be bothered to show up? The pastor's voice rose above the rain, his closing prayers solemn and familiar. I rose automatically, my body obedient to ritual, even as my mind sank into memories of those months. Around me, voices murmured comfort and farewell, but all I could hear was Timothy's voice from 2 hours ago. "This whole thing isn't worth my time." My sister dabbed at her eyes with a fresh tissue, whispering through her tears. She was blessed to have such a devoted family. Devoted. The word clanged against my ribs like an accusation. Margaret had been devoted. To her students, to me, and above all, to a son who had repaid her love with absence, who had cut me off with a single blocked number while his mother lay in her casket 50 yards away. The ceremony was ending. Mourners gathering their belongings, umbrellas rising like dark blossoms against the storm. I still hadn't figured out how to answer the questions waiting for me. Where Timothy was, why he hadn't come, how to speak truth without shattering what little dignity Margaret's memory had left. And then, as though the storm itself pulled me backward, my mind returned to that October morning 2 years ago, the beginning of the end. I saw Dr. Martinez laying out the consultation files with her practiced precision, her eyes carrying that careful neutrality reserved for devastating news. "The cancer has spread more than we thought," she said gently. "We're looking at months, not years." Margaret's hand found mine across the sterile divide, her first words not about herself, but about him. "How do we tell Timothy?" Even in the shadow of death, her first instinct had been to protect him. That evening I made the call. Son, your mother's having some health issues. The doctors want to start treatment right away. For a fleeting second, I thought I heard something real in his voice. What kind of treatment? Chemotherapy. It'll be hard, but she's strong. His answer cut me like a blade disguised as comfort. Well, keep me posted. I'm sure she'll beat it. Keep me posted. As though her life was nothing more than an update he could scroll past. At first, he visited twice. He brought expensive flowers and stayed for dinner. His concern at least plausible in those early months. Margaret lit up with his presence, asking him about work, his apartment, his future. She clung to those hours like they were proof that her boy loved her. But then the pattern returned. The flowers stayed expensive. The visits became shorter, the excuses longer. Each departure was timed like clockwork. 2 hours on the dot before he'd rise, citing early flights, crucial meetings. Margaret never wavered in her defense. He's just focused on his career. Young people need to think about their futures. By the 6th month, he stopped visiting altogether. The flowers stopped. The calls dwindled. He built his life in Manhattan, while here Margaret slipped through my hands like sand I couldn't hold. Phone calls between us became nothing more than transactions, cold exchanges of essential information. "How's Mom doing?" he would ask. His tone clipped, distracted. "She's fighting," I'd reply, clinging to scraps of optimism. "Good. Tell her I love her." And then click. That was it. No lingering questions. No plans to come home. Just another call ended like a business meeting. Meanwhile, I spent those months learning how to live 2 lives at once, husband and caregiver. I learned how to puree soft foods Margaret could swallow when everything else made her gag. I memorized pill schedules, organized insurance claims, ferried her to endless appointments, sitting there scribbling notes about treatments I could barely pronounce, let alone understand. The hospital visits were the worst. Sitting beside Margaret's chair during chemotherapy, watching poison drip into her veins while she forced a smile for my sake. All around us, other patients had visitors, children, siblings, friends who rotated shifts to ease the burden. Margaret and I only had each other. For a while that felt like enough, until I realized it wasn't. One gray December afternoon, her headscarf slipping as she tried to sit up straighter, she whispered, "Could Timothy visit this weekend? I'm having a good day. I'd like him to see me looking better." I dialed his number, my hands trembling. Less from nerves, more from the rage that had begun to carve itself permanent in my chest. "Dad, it's really crazy here. This client demands revisions by Monday, and I'm already behind schedule. Your mother specifically asked for you. She's feeling stronger today." "That's great news. Tell her I'll definitely come soon. Maybe next month when things calm down." But things never calmed down. His excuses became more polished, more professional sounding, more airtight. Important presentations, crucial deadlines, career opportunities that couldn't possibly wait, not even for his mother's dying wish. Margaret eventually stopped asking directly, but I'd catch her watching her phone whenever it buzzed, hope flickering in her tired eyes, hope that died quietly each time it wasn't him. She brightened whenever I mentioned his name, then carefully avoided asking when he might visit. It broke her slowly, piece by piece, and I hated him for it. The final months blurred together in a haze of helplessness. Margaret needed me for everything: showering, dressing, meals she hardly touched. I moved her bed to the living room so she could look out at the garden she loved, watch the birds dart to the feeder I hung outside the window. One November evening, her voice rasping beneath the hum of the oxygen concentrator, she whispered, "Maybe Timothy could come for Thanksgiving." I called him again, stripping my voice of patience. "Son, your mother is dying. She wants to see you. How long does she have?" "Weeks, maybe a month. I'll try to arrange something. Work is just insane right now. But family comes first. Family comes first." The lie was so smooth, so casual, that I almost missed how hollow it was. Did he even hear himself? Thanksgiving arrived. Margaret was too weak to eat, but she insisted I turn on the football game, because Timothy always enjoyed watching with us. She drifted in and out of restless sleep, waking to ask if he'd called. He hadn't. December brought the final decline. Margaret slept most of the day, waking only for medication, her words becoming short bursts of breath. Even then she asked about Timothy, always indirectly. Is he working hard? Does he sound happy? Tell him his mother loves him. I had stopped calling by then. What was the point? Timothy had made his choice. He had abandoned her. Promise me you'll understand him, she whispered during what would be our last real conversation. Death frightens young people. He'll regret this someday. Regret, as if his absence could be explained away as fear, instead of selfish calculation. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in January, her hands still warm in mine as dawn broke through the curtains. I held her as she took her final breath, whispering reassurances about Timothy's love that we both knew weren't true. The first call I made after she was gone was to him. Dad, is everything okay? It's pretty early. She's gone, son. Your mother died an hour ago. There was silence. And then I'll handle the arrangements from here. I know people. People. Not I'll come home. Not I need to be there. Just people. Outsiders. Professionals. Strangers. That was how he processed his mother's death. Delegation. The scraping of folding chairs brought me crashing back to the present. Around me, mourners stood, gathering coats, preparing to move toward the graveside. Margaret's casket waited, surrounded by those trembling white lilies that reminded me of her garden, of her hope, of her unwavering faith in a son who had abandoned her when she needed him most. I rose with the others, automatically accepting condolences, their gentle touches, their hushed words. They had no idea. They thought their beloved nephew was late, caught in traffic, his absence temporary and forgivable. My sister appeared beside me, clutching her purse, scanning the parking lot. Shouldn't we wait for Timothy? He must be stuck in terrible traffic. Before I could shape another lie, another cover, a familiar voice broke through the murmurs. Otis. I turned to see Thurman Hayes standing 3 feet away, his weathered hands folded neatly in front of him. He wore his good navy jacket, rain clinging to its shoulders, his face set with the same serious look he used to wear at job sites when something needed fixing. We'd worked construction side by side for 15 years before I moved into engineering. Coffee breaks, long shifts, shared curses about supervisors who never lifted a hammer. Thurman. I gripped his offered hand, surprised at the strength in his grip, the way he held it longer than expected. I've known you 40 years, he said quietly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. Where's Timothy? I didn't see him during the service. The question pierced deeper than the gentle inquiries others had made. Thurman's tone carried the blunt authority of old friendship, the right to demand the truth. He couldn't make it, I said, the words heavy as stone. He's in Florida. Thurman's brows lifted. Florida? Today? For what? I glanced around. Other mourners were drifting toward the burial site, voices hushed, movements solemn. Lowering my voice, I said the words that burned in my chest. Vacation. Said the funeral wasn't worth his time. The silence between us was thick, stretching longer than I could bear. Thurman's face hardly moved, but his eyes shifted. Disappointment, recognition, the grim knowledge of a truth he'd suspected all along. Margaret would be heartbroken, he said at last. She never got to say goodbye to him. The confession slipped out of me before I could stop it, raw and unfiltered. 2 years, Thurman. 2 years of treatments. 2 years of her asking for him. 2 years of me making excuses, believing he'd come when it mattered. Thurman nodded slowly, his gaze on the casket. I watched you support that boy for decades. But when does it end? What do you mean? I mean some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Margaret protected him his whole life. She made excuses for him, shielded him, covered for him. But maybe what he needs now isn't protection. Maybe it's the consequence he's always been spared. His words struck a chord. I thought about all the years. Margaret rushing forgotten assignments to school, calling his boss when he overslept, smoothing over friendships he'd neglected. She had called it supporting his potential. Looking back, it felt more like enabling his selfishness. She wanted me to understand him, I whispered. To forgive him. Thurman's eyes met mine. Steady, unyielding. Understanding doesn't mean acceptance, Otis. My own brother gambled away his family's savings. He only learned after the damage was done. Some people, they only wake up when the consequences finally find them. The screen filled with rows of scheduled transfers, deposits, and automatic drafts Margaret had set up long ago, her way of keeping our life orderly even as her body failed. Among them were the lines that mattered most now, a monthly deposit earmarked for Timothy, quietly arranged during those last weeks when she could still hold a pen steady enough to sign papers. She had insisted, her voice thin but determined, that her son should never struggle, that he should feel cared for even after she was gone. She'd whispered that it was her final gift to him, an inheritance disguised as steady support. At the time I'd nodded, unwilling to deny her comfort in her final days, unwilling to argue with a woman who'd spent her entire life putting others first. But now, staring at those automated lifelines to a man stretched out somewhere on a beach chair in Miami, I felt my jaw tighten. Margaret's kindness had become Timothy's shield. He had never felt consequences because she had always softened them, reshaped them, absorbed them until they vanished. But she was gone now, and with her passing the shield had finally dropped. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. It would take less than 5 minutes to shut it all down, to cancel the monthly deposits, redirect the investments, lock the pension in place. 5 minutes to end a lifetime of indulgence. My heart pounded with each click as I scrolled through options that read like small acts of rebellion. Cancel transfer, pause payments, revoke beneficiary access. Each one whispered of justice, of balance finally restored. But justice wasn't enough. If Timothy wanted to live without the weight of family, without the burden of responsibility, then perhaps he should also learn to live without the luxury that had been built on the backs of his parents' sacrifices. I leaned back in Margaret's chair, the photo of her graduation roses smiling up at me from the desk. Her faith in him had been unshakable, even when her body shook with fever and weakness. She'd asked me to understand him, to forgive him, to believe that fear, not selfishness, explained his absence. But Thurman's voice echoed louder now. Sometimes the most loving thing is letting someone face the results of their choices. I closed my eyes and pictured Timothy's sunburned face glowing in the Miami sun, his laughter blending with strangers while his mother's coffin lowered into the earth. That was his choice. And now, finally, he would face its consequences. I clicked cancel transfer. A confirmation box appeared, polite and sterile. Are you sure you want to stop this payment? My finger hesitated over the mouse. Was I sure? Was this revenge, or was it justice? Was it punishment, or was it teaching? Margaret's voice lingered, gentle but fading. He loves us in his own way. And then Thurman's, firmer, unflinching. Don't let this pass, Otis. I pressed yes. The confirmation vanished, leaving nothing but a refreshed screen, the line of payment gone as if it had never existed. For the first time in years I felt the balance shift, not in the bank, but in my chest. It wasn't triumph I felt, not yet. It was something heavier, steadier, like the ground after a long quake finally holding still. Timothy would wake up tomorrow expecting the world to continue cushioning him. Instead, he would find silence where deposits had been, absence where support had flowed, and maybe, just maybe, he would feel the hollow echo of the family he had abandoned. I closed the laptop gently, almost reverently, as if sealing Margaret's will into a vault. This wasn't betrayal of her wishes, though part of me feared she would see it that way. No. This was honoring her in the only way I knew how. She had loved him too much to let him fall. I would love her enough to let him learn. There it was, the proof staring back at me in black and white, a recurring payment of $3,200 month after month, year after year, sent faithfully to Timothy Cole's mortgage account. The next one was scheduled for April 30th, 2025, as if Margaret and I were still alive and waiting in line at the bank, ready to keep the lifeline flowing to a son who had long since stopped seeing us as anything more than his personal safety net. I stared at the number, 96 transfers, 8 solid years of monthly payments, 8 years of believing that our sacrifice would someday mean something. Margaret had clung to that hope like scripture. Every single deposit was her quiet act of faith, a mother's prayer disguised as numbers on a bank ledger. But to me, looking at it now, every line item was proof of something darker, that love, when it's not acknowledged or returned, doesn't nourish, It corrodes. It enables selfishness. It breeds entitlement. It empties the giver while fattening the taker. My fingers hovered over the mouse before I clicked on the payment history link, and then the screen betrayed us. One transaction after another scrolling endlessly down the page, each date and dollar figure a fresh wound. March 2025, $3,200. February 2025, $3,200. January 2025, $3,200. Sent at the exact time Margaret was lying in a hospital bed, her body failing, while Timothy couldn't even be bothered to walk through the door and say goodbye. I opened my calculator, though truthfully I didn't need it. My engineer's mind had already done the math the moment I saw 96 transfers, but the cold precision of the numbers made the truth bite even harder. $3,200 times 12 months, times 8 years. The total glared up at me over $300,000. $300,000. Enough to have taken Margaret on that European trip she had sighed about for years but never dared to book. Enough to finally gut and renovate that kitchen she hated cooking in, the one she grumbled about every Thanksgiving. Enough to fund scholarships for a dozen bright, deserving kids who would have cherished the help. Instead, all that money went to keeping the roof over one ungrateful man's head, a man who could post pictures of himself sipping champagne on some rooftop bar in Manhattan but couldn't pick up the phone to ask how his mother was feeling. The deeper I scrolled, the further back the betrayal went, until I found it Timothy's original email from 2017. Dad, I know this is a big ask, but the New York market is crazy expensive. If you could help with the mortgage until I get established, I promise I'll pay you back once my career takes off. I read those words over and over, my jaw tightening with every syllable. 8 years later, his career hadn't just taken off, it had soared. He flaunted it online, the 5-star dinners, the luxury vacations, the tailored suits, the weekend escapes to places Margaret and I could only dream about. He had everything, except apparently, the basic decency to repay his parents or even mention the promise he had made. I leaned back, staring at the glowing screen in the dim light of the study. My voice came out low, cracked, almost foreign to my own ears. Well, Timothy, I whispered, as though he could hear me through the pixels, you said the funeral wasn't worth your time. Let's see if your mortgage is worth mine. Margaret had spent 40 years standing at the front of classrooms, telling children that actions mattered, that responsibility wasn't just a word but a habit, something you learned by doing. She believed in the hard lessons, that sometimes love meant stepping back and letting people stumble, so they could understand the ground beneath their feet. And as I stood there, staring at Timothy's name glowing on my phone screen, I realized it was finally time for him to receive the education his mother had preached all her life. His lessons were long overdue. The past week had been the calmest stretch of my existence in years. I woke in the mornings and found solace in Margaret's garden, pruning and watering the flowers she had once coaxed to life, as if caring for them somehow kept her close. My afternoons were quiet, spent going through her belongings, touching them gently, not as a man consumed by grief, but as a caretaker honoring her memory. Evenings I passed with the books I had abandoned during her illness, the ones I could never focus on while living in constant vigilance beside her bed. For the first time since her diagnosis, I slept entire nights, uninterrupted, not needing to wake to check on someone who was no longer here to be checked on. Peace had settled over me like a blanket. Then came his name, Timothy. The phone buzzed insistently in my palm, and for 3 rings I simply watched it light up. Part of me was curious what disaster had forced him to unblock my number at last. Another part wanted to let it ring, to let him taste the silence he had fed me for years. But mostly I felt nothing. No anger, no panic. Just a mild curiosity about how long it would take for him to stop circling the edge of reality and crash headfirst into it. On the 4th ring, I pressed accept. Dad, hey, his voice, casual, breezy, was the exact tone I remembered from his younger years, when he'd call not to ask, but to assume, rides, money, bailouts of every kind. The tone of someone who believed the answer was always yes. Sorry I blocked you last week. I just needed some space after. You know, I understand, I said evenly, settling deeper into Margaret's chair, cradling my afternoon coffee. Good, good. Listen, I'm back from Florida now and there's this weird issue with my mortgage. The bank says my April payment wasn't made. Must have been a glitch with the transfer or something. Can you call and fix it? The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. No mention of the funeral he had chosen to skip. No acknowledgement of the dirt still fresh on his mother's grave. No apology for spitting on 37 years of her devotion by declaring her last farewell not worth his time. Just a problem for me to fix. A detail beneath his notice while he moved on to the things that really mattered. It wasn't a glitch, I told him. The pause that followed was thick. I heard the shuffle of papers in the background, bank statements, mortgage forms, things he'd never cared to read until suddenly the numbers stopped working in his favor. What do you mean? Just call them. You always handle this stuff. Not anymore, I said, calm as the garden outside the window. That's your responsibility now, Timothy. The silence stretched longer this time. When he spoke again, the casual tone was gone, replaced by a nervous edge. My responsibility, Dad. Come on. You've always taken care of this. What's going on? What's going on, I said softly, is exactly what you told me last week. What are you talking about? His voice quickened, frantic shuffling in the background, as though somewhere in those papers he might find an escape clause. You said your mother's funeral wasn't worth your time. My voice was level, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. Well, your mortgage isn't worth mine. The silence that exploded after those words felt like justice. I could practically see him in that glass and steel Manhattan apartment, surrounded by furniture he hadn't paid for, sipping wine purchased with the money Margaret and I had bled away each month. And now, finally, he was realizing what it meant when the support beam was removed from under the house he had built on our backs. You can't be serious, he said, voice pitching higher, wobbling toward panic. This is about Mom's funeral, isn't it? Dad, I was emotional. I didn't mean, this is real money we're talking about. Your mother was real, Timothy. Her love for you was real. Her hope that you'd visit during her final weeks was real. I was building my career. I couldn't just drop everything every time she had a bad day. A bad day. The words cut like glass. 2 years of chemo. 2 years of her body crumbling piece by piece. 2 years of watching the woman I loved fade before my eyes. That's what you reduce it to? Bad days? My throat tightened, but my voice remained steady. She died waiting for you to call. Do you even know that? Her last week she kept asking if you had phoned. Every morning she asked, and every morning I lied. I told her you were busy, that you'd call soon, because I couldn't bear to tell her the truth, that her son was too important to give his dying mother 5 minutes. That's not fair, he snapped. But the defensiveness was thinning, cracking. I sent flowers. I called. You called twice in 6 months, and both times you wanted updates on her prognosis. You never asked to speak to her, not once. The rustling stopped. In the quiet, all I could hear was his breathing, shallow and uneven, as though reality had finally caught him by the throat. Look, he said at last, I made mistakes, okay, but you can't punish me by ruining my financial stability. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm just no longer enabling you. His voice sharpened, desperate. Enabling. Dad, you promised you'd help with my mortgage. A promise is a promise. The irony nearly floored me. Timothy, the man who had broken every promise to his dying mother, lecturing me about keeping mine. And you promised to be there for your family. I replied quietly. You promised to visit. You promised to call more often. Promises work both ways, son. This is different, he muttered. That was emotional stuff. This is money. This is real. And there it was, the truth, laid bare. For Timothy, emotions were abstract, optional. Relationships were conveniences. But money was sacred. Margaret's final months were emotional stuff. His mortgage was reality. I rose from Margaret's chair and walked to the window, looking out at her garden. The tulips were blooming. Bright, defiant bursts of color against the soil. She had believed, always, in Timothy's potential. She had excused his failures, forgave his selfishness, nurtured the hope that someday he would grow into the man she raised him to be. But the garden reminded me of what Margaret never could admit. She had been wrong. Goodbye, Timothy. Those were the last words I gave him before pressing the red button, ending the call, and blocking his number with a finality that echoed louder than any argument could. Contact blocked. The same message he had once shown me, smug, when his beach vacation mattered more than standing at his mother's grave. The symmetry was almost poetic. The house fell into silence, a heavy silence. But it wasn't suffocating, it was clean, clear. The quiet of a man who has made a decision and no longer fears its consequences. Outside, Margaret's roses were beginning to bloom, resilient as ever, strong and beautiful without anyone's help. Unlike Timothy, they needed no coddling to flourish. But Timothy was not ready to accept silence. Within minutes, my phone lit up again, his name blazing across the screen, this time from a different number. His work line, no doubt, because he thought he could outsmart me, force his way back into the safety net he had always assumed would hold him. I answered on the first ring, not because I felt obligation, but because I wanted to see just how far desperation would drive him. "Don't you dare hang up on me." His voice was shrill now, an octave higher than usual, cracking with the petulance of a child who had just been told no for the first time. In that moment, I didn't hear a grown man. I heard the boy who used to scream when the world didn't bend to his will. "I wasn't planning to," I said evenly, easing back into Margaret's chair, folding one leg over the other. "This conversation deserves my full attention." "You can't just stop paying my mortgage," he spat. "Do you understand what you're doing to me?" "I understand exactly," I replied. "What I don't understand is why you believe you're entitled to $3,000 of my money every month. Because you promised." His words tumbled out in a rush. "When I moved to New York, you said you'd help until I got established. You can't just pull the rug out now. That was 8 years ago, Timothy. 8 years. Your salary is 6 figures now. Your bonus last year alone could have covered your mortgage for 2 years. Tell me, when exactly were you planning to be established?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water, rippling through the silence that followed. I could hear his uneven breathing, the sound of pacing footsteps, the restless shuffle of a man cornered by truths he had spent years outrunning. "It's not about the money," he said finally, voice tightening. "It's about family. Family helps each other." The irony was staggering. Timothy, the son who had abandoned his family when it mattered most, now lecturing me on loyalty. "You're absolutely right," I said softly. "Family does help each other. When Margaret was dying, your family needed you. Where were you?" "I was working," he shot back, quick and defensive. "I was building a future. You know how competitive my industry is. And when she died, Timothy, when she was lowered into the ground, and her brothers, her sisters, her friends, all came to honor her, your family needed you then. Where were you?" "I needed time to process," he said, weaker this time. "I couldn't just drop everything and fly to Chicago." "You didn't need time. You needed a tan. You were already in Florida, on vacation posting videos from the beach while your mother was being buried." Another silence, shorter, heavier, the kind that doesn't beg for excuses because they've already been stripped bare. "Fine," he exploded. "I made mistakes, okay. I wasn't perfect. But you can't destroy my life over it." "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly. "I'm just no longer building it for you." "This is insane," he shouted. "You're supposed to be my father." And she was supposed to be able to count on her son. My voice did not rise, though my chest burned with the weight of years. "Margaret defended you for 35 years. She made excuses when you disappointed friends. She covered for you when you broke promises. She sent you money when you cried poor. She died believing you loved her." "I did love her." His voice cracked, thin and jagged. "Then why didn't you show up when love required action instead of words?" "Because," his voice broke again, faltering, "because I couldn't handle seeing her like that. Sick, weak, dying. I couldn't do it. And so you left me to do it alone." "You're stronger than me," he whispered. "You always were. I knew you could take care of her." There it was, the naked truth at last. Timothy hadn't abandoned us because he was busy, or ambitious, or terrified of death. He had abandoned us because it was easier to let someone else bear the weight while he basked in comfort. "Margaret weighed 90 pounds when she died," I said quietly. My voice shook. not with anger, but with the heaviness of memory. 90 pounds. From a woman who once gardened for hours under the sun, who taught 30 children every day, who made you lunch every morning before school for 12 years. She spent her final weeks asking about you, hoping you would call, believing you still cared enough to say goodbye. Stop, he whispered. She made me promise to understand you, I continued, to forgive you, to keep taking care of you, even after she was gone. Then do it, he begged, his words cracking with desperation. Honor her wishes. I am honoring her wishes, I said. I'm teaching you the lesson she never could. That love requires responsibility, that family means showing up, and that sometimes the only way to honor the living is to stop excusing the absent. That was the thing about promises. Some of them can't be broken without consequences that eventually come knocking. His voice cracked over the line, pleading, almost childlike despite the man he had become. Dad, please, I'll lose my apartment. I'll lose everything. I sat there, listening, not with anger but with the kind of clarity grief sharpens into something sharp and unrelenting. And I lost my wife, I told him, my voice steady but carved from stone. I lost my partner of 37 years, the woman who spent her final days still making excuses for you. She's gone, Timothy, and somehow, you've decided your mortgage is more important than her memory. His silence hung heavy, followed by a whisper. It's not the same thing. You're right, I said quietly. It's not. Margaret's death is permanent. Your financial inconvenience, that's temporary. You have a good job, excellent credit, and 8 years of mortgage payments I carried on my shoulders for you. You'll figure something out. And what if I don't? What if I can't? The desperation in his voice should have pierced me, but all it did was remind me of nights sitting beside Margaret's hospital bed, watching her struggle for breath while he never once bothered to call. Then I said firmly, you'll learn what I learned during her illness, that some battles you fight alone, some burdens you carry yourself, and some responsibilities can't be handed off to anyone else, not even family. That was when he played the card he thought would cut deepest. I'm your son. You can't abandon me. The words struck like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because of the hypocrisy dripping from them. Timothy, who had abandoned his mother in her final days, was now throwing abandonment in my face. I let the silence stretch, then said the truth he'd spent years avoiding. And she was your mother. That didn't stop you from abandoning her when she needed you most. There was a sharp intake of breath, then a burst of anger. Fine. I was a terrible son. Is that what you want to hear? I was selfish. I was weak. I let her down, but destroying my life won't bring her back. I almost laughed, not out of humor, but from the absurdity of his blindness. I'm not destroying your life, Timothy. I'm giving you a chance to finally build one. Without my money propping it up, you might learn who you actually are. Margaret always believed you had potential. Maybe it's time you found out if she was right. The line went quiet, then bitter and cutting. This is about revenge, isn't it? You want me to suffer because I didn't come to the funeral. No, I said, my voice low and steady. This is about justice. You chose your vacation over your mother's funeral. Now you get to choose how you solve your mortgage problem. Same principle, Timothy. Your choices, your consequences. There was a final desperate dad, wait, but I didn't let him finish. Goodbye, Timothy. One click, and the call ended. Another click, and his number was blocked. The screen flashed the confirmation, contact blocked. 2 numbers down. Who knew how many he had left to try? But each one I blocked wasn't just a call silenced, it was a choice. His choice to put convenience over relationship, money over memory, himself over everyone else. The house sank into silence again, but this time it felt different. Heavier, yes, but also cleaner. Final. No more calls, no more crises, no more of my enabling disguised as love. Timothy would have to learn responsibility. The only way it ever sticks, through practice, through consequences, through realizing that generosity has limits. My eyes drifted to Margaret's photograph on the side table. For a moment I wondered what she would say if she'd heard me just now. Maybe she'd be shocked, but Margaret had been a teacher all her life. She knew some lessons couldn't be given. They had to be lived. Shielding someone from consequences isn't the same as shielding them from harm. I think you'd approve, I whispered to her image. Tough love was always your specialty, even when you couldn't bring yourself to use it on him. Outside, evening spread across the neighborhood. Through the window I watched families return home from their jobs, sharing dinners, laughter, the kind of ordinary loyalty Timothy had never shown. Tomorrow I'd wake up without worrying about his next crisis, his next demand, his next presumption that his problems belonged to me. For the first time in 8 years my money would stay in my account, right where it belonged. 3 weeks slipped by without a single call, and in those 3 weeks I rediscovered peace I hadn't felt in years. Coffee tasted like pleasure again, not like the bitter medicine I drank before another round of problem-solving for Timothy. The newspaper became news again, not a trigger for anxiety about what headline might inspire his next plea for money. I filled my mornings with things that mattered. Margaret's garden had been neglected, her roses wilted and choked by weeds, but as I worked in the soil she once loved, I found a quiet joy in carrying forward the life her hands had tended, and slowly the roses responded. They bloomed brighter, fuller, as if her absence had given them permission to flourish without constraint. With time and money finally my own, I went to the travel agency on Lincoln Avenue. The agent smiled as she laid brochures across her desk, scattering colors of blue seas and sunlit ruins. This would be perfect for someone starting fresh, she said. My wife always wanted to see the Greek islands, I told her, my voice softer than I expected. She marked pages in travel magazines, planned excursions to ruins she studied as a teacher. I think she'd approve of me finally taking that trip. It's never too late to honor someone's dreams. No, it wasn't too late. For 8 years every extra dollar had gone into Timothy's mortgage. Now every saved dollar could go into Margaret's dream. A Mediterranean cruise in June, the Greek islands, Santorini's white rooftops and sapphire seas. The kind of beauty she had dreamed about but postponed for the sake of family. When I sat down with the bank manager to open a new savings account, he raised his eyebrows at the regular deposits I planned to make. He didn't need to know that those deposits were simply redirections, money that once subsidized irresponsibility now fueling remembrance, freedom, and something that felt like healing. I called it the European Cruise Fund, a small label on a growing balance that once disappeared into Timothy's Manhattan mortgage. Each dollar that now stayed with me felt different, lighter. Numbers on a screen no longer meant enabling weakness. They meant freedom, possibilities, the quiet satisfaction of finally choosing myself and Margaret's memory over endless sacrifice. My phone stayed blissfully silent. No desperate pleas about overdue bills, no voicemails filled with panic, no late-night demands for rescue. Whatever Timothy was doing to untangle himself from his financial mess, he was doing it without me, exactly the way it should have always been. Thurman called twice during those weeks, his voice carrying the steady concern of a friendship that had lasted 4 decades. I told him about the cruise, about the garden, about how peace had settled into my bones since I stopped being Timothy's safety net. He chuckled, but there was no judgment in it. Margaret would be proud, he said. Took you long enough to learn what she always knew. I asked him what he meant, that sometimes loving someone means letting them learn the hard way. His words lingered long after the call ended, resonating like a truth I'd known deep down but hadn't dared face. The cemetery had become my quiet refuge. Each week I carried fresh roses from Margaret's garden, blooms her own hands had once nurtured. Today I came not only with flowers but with news. Kneeling by the marble headstone, I arranged the stems with care and whispered into the spring breeze. Well, sweetheart, I booked that cruise. Athens in 6 weeks. Then all those islands you circled in your travel guides. A gentle wind stirred the petals as if she were answering, approving, telling me at last to go live what we had postponed. Timothy had tried calling a few times after his mortgage collapsed, his voice tinged with shock, almost as though the concept of consequences had never occurred to him. Imagine that, I thought, resting my hand against the cool stone. I spoke to Margaret the way I always did now, carrying on our one-sided conversations. You always said I was too soft on him. Turns out you were right. Maybe now he'll learn the lessons you tried so hard to teach, the ones I kept undoing with my checkbook. The afternoon sun threw long shadows across the rows of graves, peace radiating from the silence. Other visitors moved carefully among the stones, setting down flowers, whispering their own updates to the people they missed. I felt a strange kinship with them. We were all still carrying on conversations with the dead, not because they could answer, but because speaking to them helped us live. I thought about the number again. $300,000. That's what we had poured into Timothy's mortgage across 8 long years. Enough for the kitchen renovation Margaret had dreamed of, the European trip she had planned and postponed, scholarships for students who would have treasured the chance. Instead, it had propped up one ungrateful child. I glanced at the photograph embedded in her headstone. She smiled back at me in that familiar way she had when a struggling student finally understood a lesson. Patient, gentle, but firm in her conviction that growth demanded effort. "You'd understand why I did it," I told her softly. "You spent 40 years teaching children that choices carry consequences, that responsibility can't be borrowed, and that growing up means standing on your own feet. Maybe it's time Timothy learned those lessons too without me getting in the way." Driving home, I passed through neighborhoods that had been the backdrop of my life, streets where Margaret and I had raised our family, schools where she had shaped young minds, communities that still held echoes of her laughter. Chicago in late spring was beautiful, alive with renewal, trees budding, families spilling out onto porches, children running under the lengthening light, life pushing forward as it always does. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself with ingredients I'd chosen not for thrift but for taste. I ate slowly, savoring not just the meal but the absence of tension. The house felt lighter, roomier somehow, now that it no longer carried the weight of Timothy's endless crises. On the counter lay my new passport, its pages blank and waiting. Next to it sat the cruise itinerary, travel guides spread open to maps of Greek islands, Roman ruins, Mediterranean ports. Margaret had once traced those pages with her fingers, whispering about history, culture, beauty. Now I would carry her memory across seas she had longed to see. The evening news murmured in the background. Conflicts abroad, victories at home, the ever-spinning wheel of the world. Somewhere in New York I imagined Timothy wandering the city, learning firsthand what $3,000 meant when it came from his own sweat rather than his father's wallet. I felt no guilt, no urge to step in. Margaret had left this world hoping her son would grow into the man she believed he could be. My enabling had kept him soft, untested, but no longer. Outside, spring leaned toward summer. Margaret's garden glowed in the twilight, colors bursting, fragrances drifting through the open window. In 6 weeks, I would board a ship bound for the Aegean, carrying her memory to islands where ancient voices whispered lessons about love, duty, and accountability. The phone stayed silent, and for the first time in years the silence was perfect.